I always thought silence was the safest thing in the world, until the day it started answering back. Before starting the report, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Write in the comments what time this video arrived for you. Now, enjoy your favorite horror session. Since I was a kid, I was taught to respect the dead. My grandmother used to say the body was just a shell, and that the spirit moved on to places where the living had no right to go. My mom, on the other hand, would whisper prayers every time a funeral procession passed in front of our house, and my dad preferred not to talk about it. He avoided the subject, turned his face away, as if ignoring it was his way of staying safe. I grew up with these little beliefs scattered around the house, like dust settling on the furniture. When I decided to work as an autopsy assistant, I thought all of it was just old people's superstition. Science would give me all the answers. Flesh, bone, cartilage, muscle, blood, time of death. A logical, predictable sequence. Comforting. My daily routine became mechanical. Arrive early, put on the lab coat, check the files, organize the instruments, take notes, assist with the procedures. Afterward, seal the bodies in their compartments inside the cold chamber and go home, as if it were just another office job. It started on an ordinary Thursday. The refrigeration room was especially cold that morning, colder than usual, the kind of cold that seems to stick to your bones. I was finishing up the entry log for a man in his 50s, heart attack victim, when I heard it. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't crying. It wasn't the creak of metal doors or the hum of the cooling unit. It was a conversation. I need to remember to pick up my blood pressure meds. My hand froze mid-note. I looked around. The room was empty. I told myself it was my imagination. Echo, maybe. But then, there's a game tonight. I need to let Carlos know. This time I stopped pretending it was nothing. I closed the notebook, pressed my ear against the cold chamber door, and stood there, frozen, waiting to hear more. Nothing came, just silence. A thick, uncomfortable, heavy silence. I spent the rest of the day trying to forget. I convinced myself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. Maybe a sound from the air ducts, or a forgotten radio playing in a nearby room. But the next day, it happened again. Different voices this time. I told her not to go out that night. I should have insisted more. I wonder if John's made it to school yet. 2 sentences, 2 different tones, 2 stories I'd never know the ending to. My heart raced, but my body stayed still. I stood there, listening, as if it would be a sin to interrupt. As if somehow those people were still trying to finish what they started, even after everything. That night before going home, I grabbed an old notepad and wrote, Voice Fragments, Day 1. Maybe it was just to prove to myself that it had really happened, that I wasn't losing my mind. What I didn't know was that writing it down was just the first step, and that, from that day on, I would never hear silence the same way again. The worst part wasn't hearing them, it was starting to understand. After the first day, I promised myself I wouldn't pay attention to it anymore. That's what any sane person would do, right? Ignore it. Pretend it didn't happen. Get back to routine. Focus on the files, the slides, the ID tags. But there was something there. Something pulling me back to that cold steel door. On the second day, the voices came earlier. I had just finished closing the second compartment of the morning when I heard, Tomorrow I'll call her. Tomorrow. It wasn't the same tone as before, not casual. There was regret there, an empty kind of urgency. And as I pretended to reorganize the instruments just to stay in the room, more phrases started coming. Can't forget to buy Anna's birthday gift. It's okay, Mom. I'm heading home now. It was like being in the middle of multiple phone calls, all cut off mid-sentence. Each voice, an echo of a worry that never got resolved. That night I started documenting everything methodically. Date, approximate time, number of bodies in the chamber. Part of me believed it was a way to protect myself. An objective log, as if putting it on paper, could turn the unexplainable into something manageable. But the truth was, I was becoming obsessed. In the following weeks, the pattern became clear. The voices only came when the room was empty. Never during procedures, never when colleagues were around. Only when I was alone. I started making excuses to go back there. Off schedule. Forgot my clipboard. Need to double check the refrigeration. Gotta verify the ID tags one more time. Every visit brought a new set of phrases. Gotta remember to lock the front door. I'll apologize tomorrow. Tomorrow. And the more I listened, the more it started affecting me. First came the nightmares. Always the same setting. The cold chamber, open, the bodies sitting upright, their backs to me, talking to each other like co-workers on a lunch break. But no matter how much I called them, they never turned to face me, never responded. Just kept repeating, over and over, the same phrases I'd written down during the day. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, throat dry, heart pounding like I'd run a marathon. Then came the apparitions. It started subtle, familiar faces among strangers on the street. A woman I had prepped days before, staring at me in line at the bakery. A man who died from an overdose, crossing the street just as I exited the subway. I'd blink and they'd vanish. But the shock stayed, and the fear grew like mold on the damp walls of a basement. One Saturday morning, when I was seriously considering taking a leave of absence, something different happened. I was standing in front of the chamber, about to open compartment number 4, when I heard my name for the first time. Lucas. My whole body froze. My hand trembled so hard I almost dropped the temperature log I was holding. It wasn't a random phrase. It wasn't someone else's memory. It was my identity, spoken in a tone that mixed warning and desperation. I ran out of the room that day, stood in the hallway trying to convince myself I was hallucinating, but deep down, something inside me knew I'd crossed some invisible line. I wasn't just a listener anymore. I was being included. That night I decided I had to do something. I couldn't go on like this. I went back to my apartment, sat at the kitchen table, and spread out all my notes. Pages and pages filled with scattered sentences, dates, times. Even the names of the deceased whose bodies were in the chamber at the time I heard each voice. And that's when I saw it. There was a pattern. Every voice, every phrase matched exactly the person inside the chamber at that moment. I cross-referenced the names with the intake times. It wasn't coincidence. Couldn't be. They were repeating their last thoughts before dying. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I ran to the bathroom and threw up until I felt hollow. That night I lay in bed but couldn't sleep, staring at the ceiling, my head pounding with questions. Why? Why was I the only one hearing this? What did it mean? What did they want? And mostly, the question that had haunted me since the first whisper. If what I was hearing were last thoughts, how long before I heard my own? But I wasn't done yet. 2 days later, at the end of my shift, as I was closing the last compartment, my own voice, without me knowing where it came from, just came out. You can rest now. They've done everything they could here. It was automatic, instinctual, like my mouth knew something my mind still refused to accept. And that night, for the first time in weeks, the chamber stayed silent. Not entirely silent, but distant, as if they understood. But it was too late. The fear had already taken root inside me, and I knew the worst was still to come. You can try to silence the voices, but some things, once they start speaking inside you, never stop. After that night, after whispering those words to the cold chamber, things really changed. It wasn't like flipping a switch. There wasn't a dramatic cutoff. It felt more like someone had turned down the volume on an old radio. The voices grew fainter, more spaced out, but they never fully disappeared. I kept my new habit. Every time I finished a procedure, before sealing the steel door, I'd take a deep breath and say, "You can rest now. They've done everything they could here." At first, it seemed to work. For a while, I almost believed my life could go back to normal. The nights became less heavy. The faces on the streets vanished. The nightmares eased. But then came the new dreams, not like the others. not the cold chamber, not the bodies talking. It was always the same place. A long, narrow corridor with peeling walls and flickering lights overhead. At the end of that hallway, there was a door, identical to the one on the chamber. I'd walk towards it, and just as I reached to open it, I'd wake up, sweating, heart pounding, with this strange growing feeling that I was getting closer to something. I started avoiding sleep, drank too much coffee, buried myself in tasks to stay awake until my body gave into exhaustion. The notes continued, more spaced out, but I still wrote. Until one hot Tuesday afternoon, the thing I feared most, the thing I somehow knew would happen, finally did. It was a quiet shift, just one new arrival in the chamber. A woman in her 30s, car accident victim. I had just finished closing her compartment, back turned to the door, putting away some tools when I heard it. Clear, close, no echo, no doubt. Lucas, please, don't open it. This time I didn't need to press my ear against the door, didn't need to strain to hear. The phrase was unmistakable. Close, like someone had whispered it right behind me. I spun around immediately. The hallway was empty, but the air felt heavier, like the oxygen had just left the room. The detail that crushed me, the woman, the one from the accident, her name was Lucille. It was right there on the intake form, but that voice wasn't hers. I knew that voice. I'd known it since childhood. It was my grandmother's voice, the same grandmother who spent her life saying the body was just a shell, and that the spirit went to a place the living had no right to go. My knees buckled. I held onto the counter, struggling to breathe. That night, I didn't go home. I stayed in the morgue, alone, waiting for something to happen. If I was going to lose my mind, better here, better now. I couldn't live in doubt any longer. And then, around 3 a.m, the cold chamber door opened by itself. No draft, no electrical failure, no logical explanation, just opened. Compartment number 3, which, strangely, was empty at that moment. That's when I realized it wasn't just about the dead, it was about the space, the room itself, the walls, the steel doors. It was like, after years of sealing bodies inside, something had started to open inside me too. The sound, the echo, the weight, all part of the same thing. I grabbed my notebook, and finally that night, I reread everything, every sentence, every voice, and that's when, only then, did the question that haunted me since the beginning answer itself. Why was I the only one hearing? Because I was the only one who ever did. It wasn't new. It had been this way my whole life. My grandmother's stories, my father's silences, my mother's whispers. It was all part of the same warning I took too long to understand. That's why they taught me to respect the dead. Not out of fear of them, but fear of what comes after, of what lingers in between. The cold chamber was never just a storage room. It was a boundary. And for some reason, I was on one side, with one foot almost crossing to the other. The next morning, when the first shift colleague arrived, they found me standing in front of the chamber door, eyes closed, forehead resting against the cold metal, whispering like a prayer. The same words as always. You can rest now. They've done everything they could here. And deep down, as I said it, I knew that one day, when my time came, I would want to hear someone saying it for me before the silence broke again. Before we move on to the next story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It's a pleasure to have you here. Now enjoy the moment listening to the next story. I always thought I knew how to count. Since I was a kid, my grandfather made a point of teaching me that, in certain professions, precision was a matter of honor. He was a carpenter, built furniture from cradle to coffin. Literally. I grew up surrounded by the smell of wood and varnish, listening to stories about respecting the dead. He always repeated, At the funeral, the soul stays close. It's not the time for jokes or mistakes. Years later, when I became a funeral director, I took those lessons seriously. My job was to ensure every farewell was carried out with dignity. I checked the flowers, the background music, the chair arrangements, and of course, the number of people present. We had a notebook, a simple protocol. I would note the number of family members, friends, co-workers, a kind of informal head count, but one I did with a certain pride. That's why I noticed. The first time, I thought I was just tired. It was a Tuesday night, the wake of an 84-year-old lady. I wrote down 17 attendees, but when I went to collect the disposable cups in the back of the chapel, I counted 19. 2 extra people. I stood there staring at the corner of the room, and that's when I saw them. A man in an old-fashioned suit, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, head down. Next to him, a woman in a faded blue dress, staring intently at the casket. I didn't recognize them. I discreetly asked the deceased son, but he gave me a confused look and shook his head. Said his mother didn't have that many acquaintances. When it was time to close the chapel, I checked the same corner again, and they simply weren't there anymore. In the following days, I tried to forget, blamed it on a tired mind. Working with death does that to you, I told myself. But then came the second wake, a young guy, motorcycle accident. The room was full of friends crying, people in caps and black t-shirts, typical for something like that. But there, in the back, they were there again. The 2 of them, same posture, same fixed gaze, and for the first time, I felt something was wrong with my own reality. From that night on, my mind had no rest. I started coming up with excuses. Maybe they were employees from some outsourced funeral service. Maybe distant relatives. Maybe I was seeing things. But no matter how I tried to rationalize, the discomfort grew. The following week, another wake. This time for a man named Mr. Gerald. Well known in the neighborhood, the room was packed. Faces I recognized from around town. Neighbors, former co-workers. I was near the entrance, checking the attendance list with the receptionist, when I glanced at the back of the room. There they were. Same position, same stare. The man in the old suit, the woman in the faded blue dress. My stomach turned. I couldn't pretend it was coincidence anymore. I waited until the wake was over. I stood by the door, pretending to be distracted, just to make sure. No one resembling them left through there. They didn't pass me. When the last person left, I went to the back of the room. Nothing. No trace they'd ever been there. No scent, no footprint on the polished floor. That's when I decided. For the next service, I would bring my camera. Not my phone, an old Canon I had at home, one that captured details really well. I thought photographing discreetly would be a safe way to prove to myself I wasn't going crazy. The next wake came quickly, a 40-year-old woman, sudden heart attack. Before the ceremony started, I set the camera on a tripod in a discreet corner of the room. I told everyone it was part of a new memorial service the funeral home was offering. Nobody questioned it. The ceremony went as usual, but I could barely pay attention to the prayers, the speeches. My eyes kept drifting to the back of the room, and there they were again, as always. But this time, something new sent chills through me. This time, beside them, there was a third figure, a young man, very pale skin, messy hair, sunken eyes. Someone I definitely had never seen before. He stood between them, leaning forward, as if trying to listen more closely to something. The wake ended. I waited until the room was empty. I grabbed the camera with shaking hands, ran home, turned on the computer, uploaded the photos. When the images appeared on screen, my heart pounded. They were there, clear, sharp, in the same spot in every photo, regardless of angle, time, or lighting. I went further. On impulse, I opened old folders on my computer, photos I had taken at other funerals months earlier. And that's when my blood truly froze. They were in all the photos, even from weeks ago, even in the test shots I had taken just to check the lens. The man in the suit, the woman in the blue dress, and now, the third one, always in the same corner, always with the same expression. My mind raced. Who were they? My brain concocted absurd theories. Maybe relatives of some employee? Some sort of ritual? I even went to the cemetery to discreetly ask the gravediggers. No one knew anything. I asked a photographer friend if it could be some exposure glitch. He laughed, said that made no technical sense. Late that night, while scrolling through each image one by one, I noticed a detail I had missed until then. Their faces were the same as the deceased. Yes, each one of them matched the dead person of that wake. Like a previous version? A parallel version? I don't know how to explain it. The man in the suit was Mr. Gerald. The woman in the blue dress, the lady from that Tuesday, the young man, the motorcyclist. They were all present at their own funerals. But what were they waiting for? Why always in that same corner? On the computer screen, I zoomed in on one of the photos as much as I could, stared at the face of the motorcyclist. His gaze seemed like he was looking directly at me. That night I didn't sleep. I stayed seated in front of the computer, lights off, with only the screen glow illuminating me, zooming in on every photo, every facial detail, every gaze. It felt like, with each zoom click, they became more aware of my observation, like they were noticing that I noticed them. I stopped on one image, one where the motorcyclist's head seemed tilted half an inch more than in the others, as if breaking the fixed gaze pattern at the casket and looking at me. The next morning, I made a decision I'm still ashamed of. I went to speak with the priest from the church next door to the funeral home, an older man who always performed the funeral masses. I told him just the basics, mentioned strange presences, weird images and photos. He listened with a calmness that felt too practiced, like this wasn't his first time hearing something like that. In the end, he simply said, "Son, some things only want to be seen by those brave enough to look." I left there worse than when I went in. Not what I wanted to hear. In the following days, I stopped taking pictures. I started avoiding looking toward that corner during ceremonies. But the more I avoided it, the heavier the feeling became, like a constant weight on my back, like someone watching me all the time. Then came the wake that changed everything. It was for a child, the kind of service I always hated doing for obvious reasons. Heavy atmosphere, lots of people crying, a silence that cut through the air. When I looked at the back of the room, there were 4 of them now. The man in the suit, the woman in the blue dress, the motorcyclist, and a child. A little girl in a floral dress, white socks, hair tied with a ribbon. But what froze me wasn't the fact she was there. It was the fact that, for the first time, one of them moved. The girl slowly turned her head and looked straight at me. It wasn't a lost gaze. It was conscious, director, like she recognized me. The rest of the ceremony happened in a blur. My hands shook. I dropped a coffee tray, barely managed to say goodbye to the child's family. That night, I made a stupid, inevitable decision. I went back to the funeral home at midnight, brought the camera again. Alone with the hallway lights off, I left the camera on the same tripod, pointed at the usual corner, and clicked the shutter. Once, twice, 3 times. No flash, just the dim glow of the emergency lights. Took a deep breath, walked to the corner, touched the wall. Nothing. Back at the computer, I uploaded the photos. And this time, they weren't in the back of the room. They were closer. In the first photo, still distant, as always. In the second, a few steps nearer. In the third, they were less than 6 feet from the camera. All 4 of them, the man, the woman, the motorcyclist, and the little girl, all looking directly at the lens, directly at me. I stumbled away from the screen, heart pounding in my throat, knocked over the chair, fell to the floor, and lying there trembling, one thought cut through me like a knife. They always stayed in the corner, like they were waiting. Waiting? For what? It took me minutes to gather the courage to get up and look at the screen again, and that's when I noticed the pattern. With every wake, With every new deceased, their number grew, like an invisible line, like each dead person stayed there, waiting their turn to what? I opened the folder of photos, clicked on the very first image I had of them, from weeks earlier, and then, there, a detail I had missed until now. Among the figures in the corner of the room, in that first photo, there was already someone I knew, a blurred shadow in the background, with an unmistakable shape. My grandfather. Yes, he was there, from the beginning, with the same posture I remembered, arms crossed, leaning against the wall, staring intently at the casket. My body went cold, and that's when I finally understood what he meant years ago, with that phrase I always thought was just a life lesson. At the funeral, the soul stays close. I stood up, looked at the camera, and for the first time, I wondered if I was already the one being waited for. Let's move on to the next report. But first, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. The first time I noticed someone waiting for nothing was one afternoon when the smell of old flowers seemed stronger than usual. I've been working as a receptionist at a funeral home in Cleveland, Ohio, for a little over a year. Before that, my relationship with death was simple: fear and respect. I grew up in a small rural family. My grandmother always used to say, "Our name carries weight and should only be called at the right time." I never fully understood what she meant, but the phrase stuck with me. My shift is always in the afternoon until early evening. The viewings happen in a large hall at the back, with individual chapels. My job is simple: greet people, show them where each room is, offer water, arrange flowers, sometimes calm down someone who's too emotional. Nothing more than that. That day, while updating the spreadsheet with the names of families coming to pick up ashes, I noticed a woman sitting alone in the waiting room. White blouse, dress pants, hair neatly tied back. She looked out of place. Her eyes scanned the room like someone trying to figure out where she was, slightly teary but not quite crying. "Good afternoon," I approached. "Are you here for someone?" She took a while to answer, opened her mouth, closed it again, took a deep breath. I think I'm in the wrong place," she said, her voice low and drawn out. "I came for a funeral, but I can't remember whose." That caught me off guard. Strange, but not unheard of. Sometimes distant relatives show up in a rush without knowing many details. I pulled up the day's schedule. 3 services, 2 elderly gentlemen and a teenage girl. I asked if any of the names sounded familiar. She shook her head, looking confused, lost. I went to get her a glass of water. When I came back, the chair was empty. I checked the hallway, the restrooms, the parking lot. Nothing. Asked my co-workers, no one saw her leave. That stayed with me the rest of the afternoon, but I tried to move on. 2 days later, a man in a gray suit showed up. Same lost look, same confused answer. Said he was here for a funeral but didn't know whose. I asked for his name to check the system. He hesitated, then said simply, "Sergio," without a last name. When I turned to grab the service list, turned back, he was gone too. That's when I started paying attention. I noted the exact time he'd been there. Went to Chapel 3, where a service was being held. As I walked past the casket, my stomach dropped. The man, the same man, was inside, pale, unmoving, wearing that exact same gray suit. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about the woman from 2 days before, her empty expression, that lingering feeling of absence. And I began to wonder how many others had passed through my reception without me realizing they were already dead. That question echoed in my head as I arranged the hall for the next service. The face of the man in the gray suit wouldn't leave my mind. That confused expression, that way of glancing around like he was searching for something that wasn't there. That night I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. After all, working in a place like a funeral home, it's easy to let sadness and exhaustion blur reality. But something deep inside told me this was different. I needed to understand what was happening. The next day I arrived early and decided to watch the waiting room more closely. Slowly I began noticing small, strange things. A chair that was always occupied, even when visibly empty. A water glass that mysteriously disappeared, only to reappear full the next day. Whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, subtle and barely audible. That's when she showed up again. The woman in the white blouse, sitting in the corner, staring at the door like she was waiting for something. I tried to speak to her, but as I got closer, her expression was one of deep confusion, and her words came in a soft whisper. "I'm waiting, but I don't know for who." That chilled me. It was exactly what I felt these others were doing, but never could put into words. That afternoon, I sought out the priest who came to conduct services at the funeral home. An old man with tired eyes that seemed to carry secrets he didn't want to tell. When I spoke about the people appearing and vanishing, he wasn't surprised. "Some don't know it's their time to go," he said in a deep voice. "They get stuck here, as if waiting to be called by name. And without that call, they just linger, trapped in an endless routine." That opened a new door in my mind. This place wasn't just a funeral home, not just a space for mourning the dead. It was an in-between place, a passage point for souls that hadn't realized they'd left. As the priest spoke, I remembered what my grandmother always said about names. Our name has weight. Maybe that was it. Being called by name was what freed them, what let them move on. I decided to pay even closer attention, started writing down the names of people who appeared in the waiting room, and a pattern emerged. They were always the same faces as the deceased from that day's services. People who should have been at their final rest, but who, somehow, stayed. One afternoon, I placed an extra chair in the waiting room along with a glass of water. It seemed like a small, almost meaningless gesture, but somehow I felt it might make a difference for those who still didn't understand where they were. To my surprise, the chair was soon occupied by an elderly woman with a calm face. She gave me a grateful look. She didn't speak a word, just sat, took a sip of water, and then slowly got up, fading away as if she'd finally understood. Little by little, I realized that even when trapped, these souls needed something as simple as a gesture of care, a sign they weren't alone. Maybe that was what helped them accept what needed to happen. For weeks, I kept observing, without interfering too much. Fear gave way to a strange kind of respect. I placed extra chairs, left water on the table, and sometimes softly spoke the names of those being mourned, as if offering a gentle call for them to move on. And little by little, the place began to change. The waiting room was no longer just a physical space, but a refuge for those who didn't know they had already left. A place where names carried weight and whispered hopes. Deep down, I knew my grandmother was right. A person's name holds a power that goes beyond what we can see. Maybe in that quiet and strange place, the right call was the key for souls to finally understand it was time. But the question that still haunted me was the hardest one. What if, for some, that call never comes? That question gave me no peace. For days, the unease followed me, even outside the funeral home. I found myself looking at strangers on the street, wondering if they knew the life they'd left behind no longer existed. Were there somewhere other invisible waiting rooms, other trapped souls waiting for a name that would never come? One rainy night, while organizing some documents in the office, I heard something unusual, a whisper from the waiting room. I got up, hesitant, and saw the same woman in the white blouse. She was there again, but this time her face was less confused, more determined. "I need to know what happened," she said, with a voice that seemed to carry an old urgency. "Are you waiting for a call?" I asked, trying to be gentle. She nodded, looking around as if she wanted to show me something invisible. I don't remember dying. I thought I was here for a funeral, but I don't remember whose, and no one calls me. I don't know where to go." In that moment, something inside me broke. I realized this place was more than a point between life and death. It was a prison for those who couldn't accept the end, who clung to one last hope, whatever it was. I decided I needed to act. I went back to the priest and asked if there was anything we could do to help these souls. He looked at me with tired eyes and said, "The only way is for them to recognize the truth, to understand their time has ended, that their name has been called, and now it's time to go. That very night, I prepared a simple ritual, inspired by the priest's words and my grandmother's old teachings. I would speak each name, loudly, clearly, with respect. It would be like a farewell, a call for them to find the peace they deserved. I called each name from the recent services with a steady and respectful voice. As I spoke, I could feel their presence becoming clearer, then fainter, as if the weight they carried began to lift. The woman in the white blouse looked at me, finally a soft smile on her face. She stood up from the chair and slowly began to fade, like mist dissolving in sunlight. In the days that followed, other empty chairs were filled by figures who, little by little, realized they didn't need to wait anymore. And gradually, silence reclaimed the waiting room. But there was one thing the priest told me at the end of that ritual that still echoes in my mind. Not all names will be called, and not all will hear the voice that frees them. For some, the wait is eternal until they realize it's time. Since then, I've stopped trying to intervene directly. I just keep caring for the reception, placing an extra chair, leaving a glass of water, softly speaking the names that come for viewing. I know somehow it brings comfort to those who still don't realize they've already gone. Today, when I look at the waiting room, I don't just see empty space. I see lives caught between the now and the beyond, waiting for a call that may never come, but if it does, it'll be the key to their freedom. And that phrase from my grandmother, it's never made more sense. Our name carries weight and should only be called at the right time, because in the end, it's the name that frees us from the silence. And here I remain at the funeral home's reception desk, waiting to hear the next name, ready to call and finally let them go. Some stories never have clear answers, and that's perhaps what scares us the most. To hear more stories like this, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and get ready for the next story.